Behind the Oscar-winning performances and epic battle scenes of glory lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets. From Matthew Broderick's domineering mother demanding script rewrites via private jet, to an unidentified dead body discovered on set, to Civil War reenactors who refused hotel rooms in favor of authentic period camping. These strange stories reveal a film production as dramatic as the history it portrayed. Fact 1. Broderick's mother hijacked the script. When Matthew Broderick signed on to play Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in Glory, director Ed Zwick had no idea he was getting a package deal. Broderick's mother, Patricia, was a playwright, and she had some very strong opinions about Kevin Jarrett's screenplay. What started as a few notes from the actor quickly spiraled into something much stranger and more demanding. According to Zwick's memoir, published in 2024, Broderick initially quit the project because his mother hated the script. After being convinced to return, he quit again, this time demanding a complete rewrite. He sent the screenplay to acclaimed writers like Horton Foote and Bo Goldman, hoping they would take on the job. Goldman politely declined and actually told Zwick he liked the script just as it was. But then came the real bombshell. Broderick insisted that his mother be hired to work on the script, and TriStar Pictures had no choice but to agree since they were only making the film because of Broderick's star power after Ferris Bueller's Day Off. The studio even provided Patricia Broderick with weekly private jet flights so she could fly out to work on revisions. Zwick described the experience as brutal. From the moment they met, Patricia was contemptuous, demeaning, and volatile, forcing him to defend every single line of dialogue while her son sat in silence. She wanted to add long passages from Ralph Waldo Emerson and Harriet Beecher Stowe. She also insisted on a scene where Broderick's character would be convinced to take command of the regiment by his mother, who would be played by Patricia herself. Much of this material, including Patricia's scenes, eventually ended up on the cutting room floor, but the ordeal left its mark on the troubled production. Fact 2. A dead body was found on set. In the middle of filming Glory in Savannah, Georgia, the production was hit with a genuinely unsettling mystery that remains unsolved to this day. On February 16, 1989, crew members discovered the body of a middle-aged man on the film's set, and authorities determined he had been dead for approximately 1 day before being found. The discovery happened during an already intense production schedule, with the cast and crew working on recreating the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Savannah had been chosen as a filming location because its historic architecture could convincingly double for both Boston and parts of South Carolina, and multiple scenes were shot throughout the city's downtown area. What made the incident even more mysterious was that the man appeared to have a Middle Eastern appearance, according to reports from the time, and there were no apparent signs that he had died from violence or foul play. Despite investigation efforts by local authorities, the man was never positively identified. No one came forward to claim the body, and no missing person reports seemed to match his description. The production continued after the initial shock, but the incident became one of those strange footnotes in the film's history that few people outside the cast and crew knew about. Unlike typical Hollywood stories that get repeated and embellished over time, this particular event remained relatively quiet, probably out of respect for the unknown individual. The fact that it happened on the exact same date as the film's eventual wide release the following year, February 16, 1990, added another eerie coincidence to an already strange situation. To this day, no additional information has surfaced about who the man was or how he ended up on the Glory set in Savannah. Fact 3. Civil War reenactors worked for free. One of the most remarkable aspects of Glory's production was the dedication of the Civil War reenactors who helped bring the battle scenes to life, and their commitment to historical authenticity went far beyond what anyone on the production team expected. Hundreds of reenactors from various states volunteered to participate in the film's massive battle sequences completely free of charge, refusing any payment for their time and effort. The production needed large numbers of extras to create convincing Civil War battles, particularly for the opening Battle of Antietam sequence, which was filmed using footage from a major reenactment at Gettysburg that involved around 11,000 participants. These weren't casual hobbyists looking for a fun weekend, but serious history enthusiasts who saw their participation as a way to honor the actual soldiers who fought in these battles. According to Cary Elwes, who played Major Cabot Forbes in the film, the reenactors took their roles incredibly seriously and wanted the absolute most authentic experience possible. When the production offered to put them up in hotels near the filming locations, the reenactors flatly refused. Instead, they insisted on pitching authentic period tents right on the battlefields where they would be filming, sleeping in the same conditions that Civil War soldiers would have experienced. Elwes recalled that the entire cast was filming in Georgia during hot weather, wearing heavy woolen Civil War uniforms, and while the actors complained about the heat, the reenactors never did. They simply got on with it because they wanted everything to feel as real and historically accurate as possible. This level of dedication from unpaid volunteers helped give Glory's battle scenes a sense of realism and scale that would have been nearly impossible to achieve otherwise. Fact 4. Denzel's tear was unplanned torture. One of the most powerful moments in Glory comes during the flogging scene, where Denzel Washington's character, Trip, is publicly whipped as punishment for going absent without leave. What makes this scene so emotionally devastating is that the pain Washington displays on screen was not entirely acting, and the single tear that rolls down his cheek at the end of the scene was completely unplanned and real. Director Ed Zwick wanted the flogging to look and feel authentic, so the production created a special whip that was designed not to cut Washington's skin but would still sting on impact. During filming, Washington was actually being struck with this whip at full contact, meaning he was genuinely feeling pain with each lash, even though the prop wouldn't leave permanent marks or cause serious injury. The idea was that this physical reality would help Washington deliver a more authentic performance. For the final take of the scene, something unusual happened that created movie magic. Zwick later admitted that he deliberately hesitated before calling cut to stop the flogging, which meant Washington received several additional lashes beyond what was originally planned. The result of those extra, unexpected strikes was Washington's spontaneous emotional response, with a single tear rolling down his cheek in a moment of raw vulnerability that perfectly captured his character's pain and dignity. Washington had also come up with the idea to show the deep scars already on Trip's back, revealing that this wasn't the first time his character had been whipped. Combined with the genuine physical discomfort and the surprise of those extra lashes, Washington delivered what would become an Oscar-winning performance. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1990 for his work in Glory, and that flogging scene remains one of the most memorable moments in the entire film. Fact 5. Broderick was genuinely terrified on set. Matthew Broderick's performance as Colonel Robert Gould Shaw required him to portray a young officer grappling with fear and uncertainty as he led his men into brutal Civil War battles. But as it turns out, much of that fear didn't require any acting at all. Broderick later revealed that the battle scenes were actually terrifying to film, and the explosions used on set were so incredibly loud and realistic that he was genuinely afraid during those sequences. The production team went to great lengths to create authentic and visceral battle scenes using powerful pyrotechnics and explosive charges that would make the combat feel real and chaotic. During the climactic assault on Fort Wagner and other battle sequences, these explosions were detonated close enough to the actors that they could feel the concussive force and hear the deafening blasts echoing around them. For someone like Broderick, who was known primarily for lighter roles, in films like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this level of intensity was completely outside his comfort zone. According to Broderick, when the cameras rolled during these battle scenes, he didn't have to dig deep into his emotional reserves or use complex acting techniques to portray fear and anxiety. The overwhelming sensory experience of the explosions going off around him naturally produced the exact emotions his character would have been feeling. The terror on his face was real, the hesitation in his movements was genuine, and the wide-eyed shock came from actual alarm rather than performance. This accidental authenticity actually worked perfectly for his character, since the real Colonel Shaw was a young man thrust into an overwhelming position of leadership during one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Director Ed Zwick even noted that the production nearly lost a $300,000 camera car to the rockets and explosions during the night filming sequences. Fact 6. Screenwriter Jare Cameos as trash-talking soldier. Kevin Jare, the talented screenwriter who wrote Glory's acclaimed screenplay, decided to make a memorable appearance in his own film, playing not one but two brief yet notable roles as an unnamed Union soldier. His cameo is completely uncredited, so most viewers have watched the film multiple times without ever realizing that the racist soldier causing trouble is actually the man who wrote every word of dialogue in the movie. Jare had been fascinated by the Civil War since he was a child, when he received toy soldiers for Christmas and became what he called a Civil War freak. His deep knowledge of the period and passion for the 54th Massachusetts Regiment's story drove him to research extensively and write the screenplay, which was based on Lincoln Kirstein's book Lay This Laurel, Peter Burchard's novel One Gallant Rush, and the actual letters of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. In his first appearance, Jare plays a quarrelsome white Union soldier from the 10th Connecticut who picks a fight with Denzel Washington's character Trip, displaying the kind of racial hostility that even Northern soldiers often showed toward black troops. The scene helps establish the prejudice the 54th faced not just from Confederates, but from their own supposed allies. Then, in a complete turnaround, Jare appears again later in the film as the regiment prepares for their assault on Fort Wagner, and he's the soldier who enthusiastically shouts the now famous line, "Give 'em hell, 54th," as they march toward battle. This transformation from antagonist to supporter within Jare's two brief appearances mirrors the larger arc of the film itself, showing how the 54th Massachusetts earned respect and changed hearts through their courage and determination. Fact 7. Impossible watermelons in February. Despite Glory's impressive attention to historical detail in most areas, the film contains one particularly noticeable anachronism that stands out to anyone familiar with agriculture and seasonal produce. During a training sequence at the regiment's camp, there's a scene where Colonel Shaw practices his swordsmanship by galloping past a row of stakes, each one with a fresh watermelon tied to it, which he dramatically slices apart with his sword as he rides by. The scene itself is visually striking and works well to show Shaw honing his cavalry skills and preparing for combat. But there's one major problem with it. The film clearly establishes through captions that this training is taking place in February 1863 at a camp in Massachusetts, and fresh watermelons simply would not have existed in New England during the middle of winter in the 1860s. Watermelons are warm weather crops that grow during summer months, and in the 19th century, there was no way to transport fresh watermelons from warmer climates or store them for months on end. Modern refrigeration, greenhouses, and year-round global shipping didn't exist, which meant that if you wanted a watermelon in Massachusetts, you could only get one during the late summer harvest season. The idea of having multiple fresh, ripe watermelons available for sword practice during a freezing February in New England would have been absolutely impossible. This mistake is particularly interesting because Glory went to such extraordinary lengths to be historically accurate in other areas, from the uniforms and weapons to the battle tactics and even the way soldiers wore their equipment. The production hired Civil War experts and used authentic period details throughout, yet somehow these out-of-season watermelons made it into the final cut, creating a small but noticeable break in the film's otherwise careful historical authenticity. Fact 8. Kids wore digital watches in 1863. Even the most meticulously crafted historical films can fall victim to simple continuity errors, and Glory has one of the most amusing anachronisms hiding in plain sight that eagle-eyed viewers have spotted over the years. In an early scene where the 54th Massachusetts Infantry marches through a town, the regiment passes by a group of young black children who are watching the soldiers with wonder and excitement, waving goodbye to Morgan Freeman's character and the rest of the men as they march past. It's meant to be a touching moment that shows the impact these black soldiers in Union uniforms had on the communities they encountered, especially children who had never seen anything like this before. The scene takes place in the 1860s during the Civil War, when the 54th would have been a remarkable and sharing sight for any black family living in the South. However, the young actors playing these period children apparently forgot to remove a very modern accessory before filming began. If you look carefully at the children's wrists as they wave goodbye to the marching regiment, you can clearly see that at least one of them is wearing a digital wristwatch. This wouldn't be invented for another century or so after the Civil War ended. The watches are visible for just a few seconds, but once you notice them, it's impossible to unsee this hilarious break in the film's historical setting. This kind of continuity mistake is surprisingly common in period films, where modern items accidentally make their way into shots despite everyone's best efforts. It's especially ironic given how much attention Glory paid to authentic period details like uniforms, weapons, and equipment, yet somehow these distinctly 1980s digital watches slipped through multiple levels of production, filming, and editing to end up in the final theatrical release. Fact 9. Broderick may be related to his character. One of the most intriguing pieces of trivia surrounding Glory is the possibility that Matthew Broderick didn't just play Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, but may actually be his distant relative through bloodlines that stretch back over a century. While this connection has never been definitively proven with documented genealogical records, it's widely believed and often mentioned in discussions about the film's casting. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw came from a prominent Boston family with deep roots in New England society, and the Shaw family was well connected to other wealthy and influential families in the region during the 19th century. Matthew Broderick's family also has New England ancestry, and somewhere in the tangled branches of both family trees there appears to be a connection that would make Broderick a distant cousin of the man he portrayed on screen. If this genealogical link is accurate, it adds a fascinating layer to Broderick's casting in the role. The actor would have been playing not just a historical figure, but someone who shared his own DNA, bringing a strange kind of authenticity to the performance that goes beyond acting skill or physical resemblance. It raises interesting questions about whether there might be inherited traits or family characteristics that Broderick unconsciously brought to his portrayal of Shaw. The casting decision was made primarily because of Broderick's star power following Ferris Bueller's Day Off, as the studio needed a recognizable name to help the film get made. However, if the family connection is real, it's a remarkable coincidence that out of all the actors in Hollywood who could have played this role, the part went to someone who might actually share ancestry with the real Colonel Shaw. Neither Broderick nor the filmmakers have ever made a major point of emphasizing this connection during promotional interviews. Fact 10. Broderick and Elwes couldn't stand each other. In Glory, Matthew Broderick's Colonel Shaw and Cary Elwes's Major Cabot Forbes share a close friendship that serves as one of the emotional anchors of the film, with the two characters shown as childhood friends who support each other through the challenges of leading the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Their on-screen chemistry suggests a genuine bond between the actors, but the reality behind the scenes was quite different. Director Ed Zwick later confirmed that Broderick and Elwes did not get along during the production, and their working relationship was marked by tension rather than camaraderie. The friction between them apparently stemmed from fundamental differences in their acting styles and personalities, which created an uncomfortable dynamic when they had to work closely together on such an intense and demanding project. Broderick came from a theater background and had recently achieved major success with lighter comedic roles, particularly Ferris Bueller's Day Off, while Elwes had built his career on more romantic and adventure-oriented films like The Princess Bride. These different approaches to their craft may have clashed when they were thrust together in a serious historical drama that required both men to dig deep emotionally while portraying military officers under extreme pressure. The professional discord between them became significant enough that many of Elwes' scenes ended up being cut from the final film. What was originally meant to be a more substantial role, showing the friendship between Shaw and Forbes, was trimmed down considerably in the editing room, reducing Forbes to a more supporting presence in the story. Whether these cuts were made purely for pacing and narrative reasons or partly to minimize the awkward on-screen pairing remains unclear, but the behind-the-scenes tension definitely left its mark on the finished product. Fact 11. Shaw's letters weren't actually his. Throughout Glory, Matthew Broderick's voiceover narration presents what appear to be excerpts from Colonel Robert Gould Shaw's personal letters to his mother, giving viewers intimate access to his thoughts and feelings as he leads the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. These letters are presented as authentic historical documents that help tell Shaw's story in his own words, but it turns out that not all of the correspondence heard in the film actually came from Shaw himself. Several of the extracts used in the voiceover narration were actually taken from a completely different source, a book called Army Life in a Black Regiment, written by Thomas Wentworth Higginson and published in 1870. Higginson was a colonel who commanded the 1st South Carolina Regiment during the Civil War, which was an entirely different unit from Shaw's 54th Massachusetts, though both were regiments of black soldiers serving the Union Army. The filmmakers apparently found Higginson's writing so eloquent and appropriate for conveying the experiences and perspectives they wanted to include in Glory that they borrowed passages from his book and presented them as if they were Shaw's own words. This creative decision allowed them to fill in gaps or add depth to Shaw's character using period-appropriate language and observations from someone who had actually experienced similar circumstances as a white officer leading black troops during the war. While the screenplay was indeed based on Shaw's actual letters along with other historical sources, this blending of different voices means that some of the most memorable lines attributed to Shaw in the film were actually the words of another officer entirely. The practice raises interesting questions about historical accuracy versus dramatic storytelling and whether audiences would have responded differently knowing some of Shaw's thoughts were borrowed from someone else's pen. Fact 12. Technical advisor. Became documentary star, director Ed Zwick brought in writer and historian Shelby Foote to serve as a technical advisor on Glory, helping ensure the film's historical accuracy regarding Civil War details, military procedures, and the experiences of black soldiers fighting for the Union. Foote was already known in Civil War history circles for his massive 3-volume narrative history of the conflict, but most Americans had never heard of him when he worked on Glory in 1989. That anonymity changed dramatically the following year when filmmaker Ken Burns released his groundbreaking 9-episode PBS documentary series called The Civil War in 1990. Burns had assembled a group of historians and experts to provide commentary throughout the series, but Foote quickly emerged as the breakout star of the documentary. His folksy Southern drawl, his gift for storytelling, and his ability to bring historical events to life in vivid detail made him the most memorable voice in the entire production. What's particularly remarkable is just how much screen time Foote received compared to all the other experts featured in the documentary. When his total appearances were added up, Foote had approximately 1 full hour of airtime throughout the series, which was more than any other single commentator. His presence became so dominant that many viewers remember the Civil War primarily for Foote's contributions, even though the documentary featured numerous other respected historians and scholars. The success of the Ken Burns documentary transformed Foote from a respected but relatively obscure Civil War historian into a household name and cultural icon. His 3-volume Civil War narrative, which had sold modestly before the documentary aired, suddenly became a bestseller as 40 million viewers were introduced to his compelling way of discussing history. Glory had benefited from his expertise behind the scenes, but it was the Civil War that made Shelby Foote famous. Fact 13. Dom Perignon before it existed. Glory pays meticulous attention to historical details in most respects, but one particular anachronism slipped through that involves a very recognizable luxury brand. In an early scene that takes place around the 13-minute mark, Carrie Elwes' character, Major Cabot Forbes, is shown holding a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne while having a conversation with Matthew Broderick's Colonel Shaw about the newly formed Black Regiment. The problem with this prop choice is that Dom Perignon as a commercial champagne brand didn't exist anywhere near the time period when Glory takes place. The film is set during the American Civil War in 1863, but the first vintage of Dom Perignon champagne wasn't actually produced until 1921. That's a gap of 58 years between when the scene supposedly takes place and when the product being shown would have been available to purchase. while there was indeed a Benedictine monk named Dom Pierre Pérignon, who lived in France during the 17th century and made important contributions to champagne-making techniques, the prestige champagne brand that bears his name is a 20th century creation. The Moet and Chandon Company developed Dom Pérignon as their premium champagne label, with the first bottles released after World War I, decades after the Civil War had ended. This kind of mistake is particularly noticeable because Dom Pérignon is such a well-known and distinctive brand, with its recognizable label and bottle shape. Someone in the props department either didn't realize the historical issue or simply grabbed an elegant-looking champagne bottle without checking whether it would have existed during the 1860s. For a film that went to such lengths to get period uniforms, weapons, and military equipment correct, having a character casually hold a bottle from the wrong century stands out. Fact 14. Jane Alexander's Scenes Vanished. The production of Glory involved casting veteran actress Jane Alexander to play the mother of Matthew Broderick's character, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, which should have been a significant supporting role given the Shaw family's prominence in the story. Alexander was a highly respected actress with 4 Academy Award nominations already to her name by the time she took on this part, so her involvement suggested these scenes would be important to the final film. However, nearly all of Jane Alexander's scenes ended up being cut from the theatrical release of Glory, leaving her with barely any presence in the finished movie despite the time and effort spent filming her role. This wasn't just a matter of trimming a few lines here and there, but rather the complete removal of substantial scenes that were meant to establish the Shaw family dynamics and provide context for Robert's upbringing in an abolitionist household. The situation becomes even more complicated when you consider that Matthew Broderick's real mother, Patricia, had insisted on adding a scene where Shaw's mother would convince him to take command of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and she wanted to play that role herself. Director Ed Zwick had been forced to accommodate these demands during the script development process, creating additional material specifically to satisfy Patricia Broderick's requirements for her own appearance in the film. In the end, both versions of Shaw's mother essentially disappeared from Glory. Jane Alexander's professionally crafted performance was left on the cutting room floor, and Patricia Broderick's insisted upon scene also failed to make it into the final cut. The editing process focused the narrative more tightly on Shaw's relationship with his soldiers rather than his family background, which meant these maternal figures that had caused so much trouble during production ultimately contributed almost nothing to the story audiences would see. Fact 15. The Christmas That Never Happened. Glory includes scenes showing the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment celebrating Christmas together at their training camp, with snow on the ground, and the men gathering for holiday festivities during what appears to be a meaningful moment of bonding and reflection. These scenes help establish the camaraderie among the troops and show them building relationships during their time together. But there's one significant problem with this depiction. It would have been chronologically impossible for the 54th to celebrate Christmas during the period covered in the film. The historical timeline of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment simply doesn't allow for a Christmas celebration to have occurred. The regiment didn't begin recruiting volunteers until February of 1863, which means the unit didn't even exist yet during the Christmas of 1862. The soldiers trained together through the spring months and departed for their deployment in South Carolina, where they saw their first combat action in the summer of 1863. The film culminates with the assault on Fort Wagner, which took place on July 18, 1863, where Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was killed leading his men into battle. This means that from the regiment's formation in February through Shaw's death in July, only 5 months passed, and none of those months included December. The 54th would go on to serve throughout the rest of the war, but Shaw was no longer with them, and the film ends with the Fort Wagner battle. The inclusion of Christmas scenes appears to have been a creative decision to add emotional depth and show the passage of time during training, even though it creates a historical impossibility. The filmmakers apparently felt that showing a holiday celebration was worth the anachronism for dramatic purposes, prioritizing the storytelling impact over strict chronological accuracy. Chronological accuracy. Chronological accuracy. Chronological accuracy.